uma apresentação.
So hello and welcome everybody to this talk on the Preston Model and community world building, which I'm also going to connect to climate action. So I'm going to begin at the very beginning of the Preston Model, trying to understand why the Preston Model came about. What were the first steps? This began 10, 11 years ago or more, 12 years ago. And since then, there's been a gradual sense of progress from the beginnings to the present day. But why did the Preston Model ever begin in the first place? So in order to answer this question, we have to go back all the way to November 2011. In November 2011, there was a little local disaster in Preston because the Tithe Barn regeneration scheme, which was worth approximately £700 million, and was a good example of the strategy of inward investment, that Tithe Barn project, the regeneration scheme for Preston, collapsed. This, of course, was the result of the financial difficulties since 2008. And by the time we got to 2011, the big retailer that had agreed to go to Preston said they weren't going. And as a result of that, the other retailers stopped going and this whole project collapsed. So this is an artist's view of what the Tithe Barn project would have looked like. And you can see it's full of the modern capitalist ideas of what a beautiful retail park would look like. It has its outdoor escalators, it has its rooftop gardens, it has its cafes alongside windows that come open. It's got a pedestrian walkway. So this represented the ambition of the time in 2011 and 2012, and this collapsed. And as a result of the collapse, there was an urgent need to think out of the box. Out of the box because in 2011, 2012, 2013 in the United Kingdom, there was absolutely no money available for any kind of inward investment. So the collapse of the Tithe Barn project meant that in Preston, there was nothing, absolutely nothing. And so there were two alternatives to nothing. One is to do nothing and fall into an economic and social disaster. And the second option, the option that was taken up by Preston City Council, the local authority in Preston, was to try to think out of the box and to appeal to people's sense of cooperation and mutual support. So there was a crying need for solidarity. But this need for solidarity, this need for cooperation was very sudden and very out of the blue. Nobody had considered any alternative to inward investment. So we began a project of trying to find inspiration for alternative socio-economic models for Preston. So here are some of the alternatives. We thought of different ones as well, but these three different alternatives, particularly the one which is Mondragon and the one which is Evergreen, they were particularly influential in inspiring ideas for a new alternative model in Preston. So from Mondragon, the Basque Country, where they have an ecosystem of cooperatives joined together in a single cooperative network, the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation. In Preston, we were inspired by the idea that successful businesses could in fact work in cooperation, and they could work in cooperation within the business itself and also from co-op to co-op to co-op. And we're not talking just about small little businesses like little shops. We're talking about big industrial complexes working cooperatively. Now that's important because before looking to Mondragon and before becoming inspired by the ideas of Mondragon, people's ideas of cooperatives in the UK and in Preston were either they didn't know anything about cooperatives, or a cooperative was a very small organization, for example, an organic grocer, for example, with 2 or 3 people, often as a family. So very, very small scale businesses. And what Mondragon taught us was that it was possible to work cooperatively on a large scale and to be successful. And it's very important for developing the Preston model, because large scale businesses mean big profits. And the whole problem of the decline of the Tide Barn project was that there was no money. There was no money in Preston. So in Preston, we were looking for ways of generating local wealth, a lot of local wealth, not a little bit, a lot of local wealth. And of course, there is a progressive and political aspect to developing wealth, because although we wanted to develop wealth, we didn't want to develop wealth in exploitation of people. We wanted to develop wealth with quality jobs and people who were proud to work in cooperation. So the idea of working in cooperation had first the idea of generating wealth, second, the idea of generating wealth locally, and third, the idea of introducing ideas of solidarity, democracy, and cooperation. We got some other ideas from Cleveland, Ohio. So in Cleveland, Ohio, the evergreen cooperatives were developed, and they were developed with a similar idea, but with one difference to Mondragon, an important difference. In Cleveland, Ohio, they developed the idea of anchor institutions. The anchor institution is a big institution that is rooted in a place. For example, and a good example for Cleveland, the local hospital. The hospital is a big employer. It's an employer that spends a lot of money, and it's rooted in the place. If you have good times, it's there. If you have bad times, it's there. So it's an anchor institution. And the idea from Cleveland was, if you could get anchor institutions to change the way they dealt with employment and to change the way they dealt with procurement and buying things, if instead of poor employment, they were more interested in quality employment, instead of buying products from outside Cleveland, for example, or in this case, outside Preston, instead of buying products from outside, you could buy products locally, then local wealth would be generated. But it would also be generated with quality employment. So this is where, by chance, and it's interesting because the Preston model, a lot of the Preston model was developed by chance, by desire, not by design. And I think that's also very important. By desire, not by design. The desire was absolute because, as I said in the beginning, there was nothing left. So there was a desire, but there was no design because nobody knew what we were doing, which is why we were looking for new ways of working. So my role in the university was to invite speakers and invite collaboration from outside the university to come to Preston and to talk to us in Preston about the successes of the different initiatives that they were pursuing in their own place. So, for example, in particular, the very first person we invited to Preston was Michael Lethamith from the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation. And Michael Lethamith is a world-renowned expert in the Mondragon cooperatives. And he was able to come to Preston and come to the university and offer a variety of classes and workshops and lectures to the university. Some of those classes were small classes directed to undergraduate students. Some of the lectures were within the university, but some of them, in particular, one major lecture was a public lecture, where not only the university staff and students were invited, but also people from the public, members from the public. And at that lecture, we received a lot of people from the council, Preston City Council, arrived to that lecture. And it was precisely because of this public lecture that I was able to make contact with councillors, with leaders from the council, Preston City Council. And from that moment on, from around about November 2011, I was able to develop a partnership with politicians and leaders in Preston City Council. And it's a very, very fruitful and interesting partnership. From a university perspective, you have the creativity of ideas, the putting forward of alternatives, the intellectual background between what is possible and what is not possible. And from the council point of view, from the political point of view, you have the pragmatic, practical action of putting the ideas into practice, and also the network of contacts that the council is able to maneuver and able to lead. It was very interesting that from a pragmatic or practical perspective, it was the contacts that the council had, not the money, the contacts, which was important. They had contacts in community. They had contacts with businesses. They had contacts with anchor institutions. They had contacts with charities, with not-for-profit organizations. They had all the contacts. And so when the ideas were put forward, they were able to bring people together in order to put the ideas into action. And we must remember, all of this was done without any money. It's very important, because from the very beginning, we were worried about not having money. And the council at that time especially had no money, because the central government was cutting the budgets of local councils, cutting and cutting and cutting the budgets. And of course, the council, faced by cuts in budget, would be very careful with the money that they spent. This second example here is an example of the continuing partnership with Mondragon. And I think it's fair to say that the success of the Preston model is based, at least in part, on partnerships. So it's not that Michael Lefamith came in 2011 in November and he gave public lectures and talks and classes, and then he went back to Mondragon and that was finished. It wasn't like that. Over the years, we've had several visits from people from Mondragon, different visits, consultancy visits, visits by experts, and this is an example of, I think, the third or the fourth visit by people from Mondragon to Preston. And what they are able to do is react to the progress made in Preston and offer different advice and interchange ideas about ways of moving forward. So the initial research, which I began with a colleague at university, was about understanding solidarity, cooperation, and mutual support. And to do that, we initiated a research project, a scoping project, to understand the potential for cooperative development in Preston, remembering that cooperation and cooperative development in Preston was almost non-existent in Preston. It was non-existent in practical terms. There were hardly any cooperatives, but it was also non-existent even in ideas, even in theoretical terms. I think it's fair to say that the United Kingdom is a country deeply steeped in standard, traditional, neoliberal systems of work and social organization. And so any alternative to that was almost unknown. So we were scoping the potential for cooperative development. So in 2016, we published a report on the research called Cooperative Activity in Preston. We followed it up with a second report trying to answer the research question, what is the potential for developing a cooperative culture in Preston? While we were doing that, we were also working cooperatively with the autonomous government of the Basque Country, and we included a research visit to Mondragon in order to make sure we were keeping in touch with the reality of development, the reality of the Mondragon cooperatives, not the theory, but actually understanding how things work on the ground. And we were very fortunate to be funded by the autonomous government of the Basque Country to make a research visit to Mondragon and to work in cooperation with the people who inhabit this building, which is Otalora, which is the management training center in Mondragon, and developing a partnership with them, which continues to this day. And as a result of this report, we recommended these recommendations to the City Council. First, the formal setting up of a network of cooperative groups in Preston, facilitated by the Council, giving it status and legitimacy, and link it to citywide goals and initiatives. Although information and advice is vital, there's also scope for proactive developmental role. So that was the first recommendation, to set up a network which would join together cooperative businesses, so that we're not talking about the development of isolated businesses. One of the problems of the neoliberal system is this idea of working in isolation. And when the business works in isolation, the business also works in competition with other businesses. And we were not interested in businesses working in isolation, in competition with other businesses. We wanted cooperative businesses that worked together cooperatively with other businesses. So in order to encourage that, there would have to be a network of cooperative groups in Preston, similar to the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation that joins together the different cooperative businesses in Mondragon. Second, the network can be developed in line with other local economic and social strategies, especially those highlighted by the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, which is a think tank centre that worked with the council and to some extent with the university to develop the procurement strategy in Preston. So despite financial cuts, the council exercises influence in key areas of the local economy and retains potential as an enabler. Number three, in conjunction with the network of cooperatives, the four pillars of cooperative development: education, finance, R&D, welfare and health can be promoted. And this comes directly from the work of Michael Lethamith when he came to Preston, and he was discussing the development of a Mondragon ecosystem. And as part of that ecosystem, he explained that it wasn't enough to have a network of cooperatives. That network of cooperatives needed to be supported by four pillars. And his visual aid, that was a tabletop with the cooperatives and four legs holding up the table. And these legs were education, which has been fundamental to the development of cooperatives in Mondragon since the beginning; finance, because there's no business without lending money; research and development, because innovation is key to making successful businesses; and welfare and health. To a certain extent, the fourth one, welfare and health, was very important when the Mondragon cooperatives began, because when the Mondragon cooperatives began, there was no national health service, nothing, and so they had to develop their own. In the United Kingdom, so far, we still have a national health service, so this fourth pillar is a little bit less important. But as we're going to see in the talk later on, the pillars of education, finance, and research and development, innovation, are absolutely key for the sustainability of the development of the model. 4, a creative approach should be adopted in relation to council property offices that are currently out of use, such as renting of disused council property to fledgling cooperative organizations. And this is a fantastic example of turning a disadvantage into an advantage. So the council, because of central government cuts to the budget, the council had to reduce its staff. And so in reducing the staff, they had empty offices in the middle of the town. And so they were encouraged to use those empty offices to help increase the space available for cooperative businesses. And one very good example of that is the development of the Burley Art Studios. So one of the problems in Preston and one of the problems for the university was that university fine art graduates, artists, when they finished their degree in the University of Central Lancashire in Preston, there were no studio spaces. There was a very poor cultural atmosphere in Preston. And so when they finished their degree, they went away. They went away to London, to Manchester, to Liverpool, to big cities with more opportunities. So what we did in conjunction with the council, what the university did in conjunction with the council, was offer empty council office space for the fine art graduates at a tiny symbolic rent. And the result of that is that we now have a large, thriving artists, studios, and gallery in Preston, which encourages the graduates to stay in Preston and give back to Preston in terms of cultural capital, give back to Preston what Preston in the university gave to them. And so it's a fantastic example of the developing and the retention of cultural capital. And people in Preston can see that Preston, which used to have almost no culture, almost no art, is now an interesting place for art and culture. One of the conditions for giving this council property to the young artists was that they should give something back to the community. And so they can't just stay in their studios, they have to go to the community and offer something back to the community. So a very good example of the psychology of the Preston model. 5, national and regional links to hubs of cooperative activity should be encouraged. Connections to international cooperative organizations such as Mondragon and the Evergreen Cooperatives should be strengthened, including reciprocal study visits. And the idea behind that was very good from the beginning, because first of all, the people in Mondragon and the people in Cleveland, Ohio, could come to Preston and offer thought, advice, encouragement for the development of the Preston model. So that was absolutely essential. And also, there's always the danger with a local project. There's always a danger of becoming isolated, becoming parochial, becoming a project that looks inside itself and ignores the outside world. So to maintain partnership contact with the outside world is also important from that perspective. Okay, so one of the features of the Preston model is a change in procurement habits, and that's connected to what I was saying before, trying to encourage the local anchor institutions, the big organizations in Preston, which are, for example, the hospital, the local authority, the housing association, the university itself, the police, etc. The big organizations, trying to encourage them to change the way they spend their money. So Preston City Council worked with the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, CLES, to design changes to local procurement to encourage the creation and the retention of local wealth. The creation of wealth from inside, not the injection of wealth from the outside. This is the fundamental point about the Preston model. And then once the wealth is created inside, it stays inside. It doesn't go out. So as you know, with a typical inward investment in the traditional style, the money comes in to a place, it's generated, and then it goes out to the shareholders. And the shareholders have no connection with Preston. The shareholders maybe are in some Swiss bank somewhere, okay? So even if money is generated with inward investment, a lot of that money goes out again. So the strategy was twofold: generating money locally and retaining it, keeping the money locally. And you can see, by the way, how a cooperative business would be much more successful than an ordinary business in this respect, because a cooperative business will consist of people who own their own business, not who depend on shareholders, people who own their own business. So any money that's made in the cooperative locally goes to the cooperative workers or to the community, not outside. So that's one way that you can retain local wealth. So anchor institutions were encouraged to change their procurement habits for the benefit of the local economy. And there's a whole report about this available on the CLES website that shows that it was done and it was successfully done. So I think it's quite interesting to consider what the Preston model actually means, because when we began work in 2011, we didn't think to ourselves, oh, we must build a model. We didn't think that. What we thought was, this is a terrible situation. We have a disaster, an economic and social disaster in Preston. What can we do? And we thought, well, we do anything we can. We didn't think to ourselves, we will sit down and design a strategy which we will call the Preston model. In fact, the Preston model was a name given to us by the newspapers. We didn't invent that name at all. So it's much more connected to creativity, motivation, desire, innovation, not careful design, careful strategy, careful planning. It was very much an organic development. So as it began to develop, we started understanding that we maybe could call the Preston model some kind of design, and that design might be not only available for Preston, but it might be available for people outside Preston. So one of the aspects of the model is clearly this model, procurement and cooperation. So procurement, developing local wealth from the anchor institutions you can see there in the middle, and doing it with cooperation. That's so important, because changing procurement habits, increasing financial and economic wealth in a way that was not cooperative, in a way that was competitive, was not the way we wanted to design the Preston model. In 2017, following on from the report in 2016, we created the first of those conditions, the Preston Cooperative Development Network, of which I was the first chair. In that picture to my right, sitting down, is Councillor Matthew Brown, who is currently the leader of Preston City Council. So the picture is very symbolic of the partnership between the university and the council. And it is because it's the Preston Cooperative Development Network, not the Preston Business Network, but Preston Cooperative Development Network. It's cooperative values and principles that guide the Preston model, and so community wealth building. And these principles and values are essential and have been essential for keeping the model going. Something a bit more than just about the money, but about helping people to develop self-help, to help themselves, to give them agency, empowerment and control, self-responsibility, to depend on themselves, to make decisions in participation and in democratic governance, democracy, working together to understand all the different points of view that might be in a business, a cooperative business, or in a community, or in the society within Preston as a whole. How could we encourage democracy to be inclusive? Equality and equity, fairness for all, and solidarity. So these cooperative principles were as important, not more, not less, as equally important to the idea of creating financial wealth. They work hand in hand. So we're interested in financial capital, but we're also interested in so-called social capital. We really did understand from the beginning, maybe instinctively, that finance without the commitment and engagement of people, and without the finance coming to benefit people in a social way so that people could see their communities improving, finance on its own was not going to work, was not going to be enough. The finance had to be intimately linked with a social capital, a feeling of well-being, a feeling of health, a feeling of agency, a feeling of control, a feeling of developing positive relationships among people, a feeling of reducing racial discrimination, a feel of increasing inclusivity. All of these things, all of these aspects of social capital were equally important to the financial aspect. And this was something which standard economics found hard to understand, because the standard neoliberal economic perspective always begins with the numbers and always begins with the money. So the Preston model is a demonstration of the need to put the quantification of money and an improved economic financial situation with the qualitative understanding of what this means to people in a social sense. So round about 2014, Claire's worked with anchor institutions. Now, the reasons for anchor institutions being so important are these three reasons, and they're vital to understanding why it's important to change procurement habits for local anchor institutions. First of all, the anchor institutions are rooted in the place. We all know that a private commercial organization, even a big one, if it's in a place and something goes wrong, if there are difficulties, financial difficulties, then what does the place do? It closes and makes its people redundant. That's what it does. But an anchor institution can never do that. At least, hopefully, they can never do that. Because an anchor institution, for example, the hospital, it will always be there. It will always employ a lot of people. It will always be caring about the nature of employment in good times and in bad times. It will always need to buy things for the hospital. So if those anchor institutions could change their procurement habits, then the wealth would be generated in Preston and retained in Preston. The anchor institutions tend to be big spenders as well. They spend a lot of money. So the University of Central Lancashire has a huge budget, and so does the hospital, and so do the local authorities. They have a lot of money to spend compared to businesses. And so if you can get them to change their procurement habits, then you're talking about a lot of money. And of course, they're big employers. They employ a very large number of staff. So this is why we began with anchor institutions. In those days, the United Kingdom was still part of the European Union, and the European Union funded Preston City Council to compare different wealth building initiatives with different cities in Europe. And this was called the URBACT project. And it was very engaging and very interesting to see the different perspectives and views of how different cities in Europe could face similar problems. And one of the things it brought out, which I think is really important, is that you're not going to have exactly the same ideas, exactly the same system for every city that wants to adopt community wealth building. So community wealth building needs to be adaptable and flexible according to the needs and requirements of each place. And the requirements of Preston are not the same necessarily as the requirements of a city in Italy, for example. They're going to be slightly different. What's not different are the principles and the values. The principles and values are the same, but the way they are tackled may be slightly different according to the different places. And what this led to was major changes in anchor institution procurement, attention to social value, and an increase in generation and retention of local wealth. And these are the facts, okay? These are the facts only until 2017. So since the Preston model has continued to develop, the results for now will be even better and even more impressive than these. But these results are really very striking, that in a 5-year or less than a 5-year period, from 2013 to 2017, in 2012 and 13, in Preston, local anchor institutions spent 5% of their budget in Preston. In 2017, they spent 18% of their budget in Preston. That's just in the city of Preston. Now, Preston is within a region called Lancashire. And if you look at the statistics for Lancashire, it's even more impressive. So in 2013 in Lancashire, the anchor institutions spent 39% of their local budget in Lancashire. In 2017, it was nearly 80% of their budget was spent in Lancashire. So we're talking about an increase of £200 million in the space of 4 years. That's £200 million in Lancashire and £74 million in Preston. All of that is money generated in Preston, which used to be generated outside Preston. Now it's generated in Preston and retained and spent in Preston. And so local wealth has increased in a short time to a very large degree. So I'm going to mention very briefly the economics behind the Preston model. And I have a colleague that I wrote the book with on the Preston model, Phil Wyman, who helped me with these slides because I'm not an economist. Okay, so you've got the two models, which I think we've already discussed to a certain extent. The orthodox, at least in the West, in Europe, the orthodox economic development model, as you can see with all the arrows, is all about inward investment of different kinds, inward capital investment, investment of labor and skilled labor, migration of people, and of course a national central government policy which is always about controlling and investing from a central place into another place. And that is the standard development model. That was the model of the Tithe Bomb project. And as a result, development is encouraged in and done to a community. And the control of the inward investment of the labor, of the migration, of the policy, of the capital, the control of that is not located in the local place. The control of that is located in the corporations, it's located in the government, in the center of the nation, it's located in different places. And so the people that it's done to have no control, no authority, no way of deciding any aspect of the inward investment. The Preston model, the community wealth building development model, is the other way round. Skills are developed within Preston because of a development of education and a partnership with the university. For example, the skills of the arts graduates from the university is retained within Preston. They're not asking for culture to come into Preston, they're developing the culture within Preston. Ideas developed between the university and the community and the local council, not imported from outside. Capital, financial capital and natural capital, social capital, again, all developed from within, and ideas can go outside. So it's done by the local community. It's true that we have input from places like Mondragon, which is outside, but that's not an exploitative input, it's a partnership. All right, so when something comes in from the outside, it comes in terms of partnership. They're not coming to Preston to take something, they're coming to Preston to collaborate and cooperate. So the idea is similar, but not the same as the circular economy. What we quickly discovered was that the finance, the wealth in Preston is a bit like a bath with water, but with a leak. So anything that was made, any money made in Preston would leak out of Preston, for example, to stakeholders or shareholders outside Preston. So if you can change spending decisions, local procurement, so that more money is spent locally, it'll have a multiplier effect. You can strengthen local supply chains, you can grow small businesses, and then the activity will rise again. All right. So all of these things create a different idea of how the local economy could work. And this is how the Preston model and community wealth building thinks it could work. And to some extent, it does work like this. So there is evidence for this. So Phil Wyman and myself wrote a book on the Preston model, and there's more detail about the academic economic evidence for this, which is also summarized in this slide. We've already seen the evidence for the wealth generation and retention from change of local procurement habits from anchor institutions, and there are other examples here. So the Preston model is work in progress. There's sufficient evidence to suggest it's had a positive impact, and the positive impact is measurable in terms of the money, which we've already seen, but it's also measurable in terms of how people feel about the Preston model, the sense of pride, for example, the sense of health, the sense of well-being, the sense of empowerment, the sense of agency, the sense of being in control, so that communities are encouraged to feel differently about living in Preston, to not feel sad, depressed, or stressed about living in a place with no opportunities, but on the contrary, to feel that at last there's a way of taking back control of their lives and developing something in relationship with others in their community. The model continues to develop from its early days. So one of the developments established in 2021 is the development of the Preston Cooperative Education Centre. And this speaks to the very original recommendations of the initial report on cooperative activity in Preston and the recommendations from Michael Lethamith of education being one of the pillars of developing a cooperative ecosystem. And we realized one of the mistakes we made was not to do this before. It was quite late, okay? We should have done it before, because we were so enthusiastic to start quickly with developing the cooperatives and a different social economy. We were so enthusiastic that we forgot that a lot of people have difficulties in understanding these possibilities, and many people, as I said before, had no idea what a cooperative was. And so you were encouraging people to develop a cooperative, but they didn't even know what a cooperative was. And of course, we should have known better, because Jose Maria Arizmendi Areta, the priest who founded the cooperatives in Mondragon, the first thing he did was to create an educational center. That's the first thing he did. He didn't create the cooperative first. He created the education center first, exactly for that reason. And you know, we left it late, but at least it's done now. So that's one of the pillars of success, is the development of this cooperative education center. Something which is still in development, and once again inspired by Mondragon, is the development of the Northwest Mutual Community and Cooperative Bank, because the big banks, Santander, HSBC, Barclays, etc., 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 the big banks will not lend money to small cooperative businesses. Okay, they won't. And so you have a problem, because you want to develop proper businesses. You want to develop businesses that make money, because money is what helps the model to continue as long as the money is ethically spent. All right. So we needed to find a way, and we still need to find a way to have a bank that will lend money for cooperative development. So this is a very, very big project. I don't know what it's like in Brazil, but in the United Kingdom, to actually create a bank is a huge project involving massive amounts of capital and so on. So we're, I would say, maybe halfway there. And we expect in 2 years' time, the first branch of this bank to be opened in Preston. But we're still working at it. It's registered with the Financial Conduct Authority, so it's formally registered, but it hasn't actually begun working yet. But the idea is that it serves the financial needs of ordinary people. It redresses inequalities, and it makes financial inclusion possible for everybody. It increases the proportion of bank lending going to the real economy, the economy in Preston, not the economy in Switzerland or somewhere else. It builds economic resilience in the local place, and it brings about a revitalization of customer service, because one of the aspects of the bank is that it will have a physical location. The tendency in banking is to bank online, but this bank will have a physical location, because the Preston model is about people, real live people in place. And even the bank is going to lend money, yes, but it's not just about lending money, it's about establishing relationships with people as well. So education, finance, two of the big pillars of the system are in development. The research and development and innovation can be seen as a partnership with the university, and the health and welfare, we have a health and welfare system already, even though it's under pressure. So more or less, this is the way the system is designed. So in the middle, of course, you have the Preston, the city of Preston. On the top there, you have the anchor institutions working alongside the Preston Cooperative Development Network that encourages the development of cooperatives and the interconnectivity of cooperatives. They work alongside Preston City Council. The council is very much in partnership with the University of Central Lancashire. And recently, the Preston Cooperative Education Centre provides a different kind of education. Of course, the university provides higher education. The Cooperative Education Centre is more inclusive and is focused on cooperative education. And what I've just mentioned now, the Northwest Mutual Community and Cooperative Bank. So this, I think, is a sort of good schematic summary of what the Preston model consists of. And as I said before, we continue with our relationship with Mondragon. We began with simple, direct information provided by someone like Michael Lethamith in 2011. And recently, we've continued with a more detailed and more sophisticated interchange of ideas with the Mondragon consultancy group called LKS. And these two reports were created by them in conjunction with community groups in Preston. And there are two reports. One report is about developments in community wealth building in the Basque Country, because they have been moving and developing from Mondragon to Bilbao, which is a big city in the north of the Basque Country, and working with the council in Bilbao. So one of the reports is about that one. And the other report is about developing the ecosystem in Preston, a report developed in conjunction with community consultation actually in Preston. And these are the four areas of ecosystem development that we've been advised to concentrate on as a result of these meetings with LK's consultancy in Mondragon. First of all, to develop inter-cooperation, to make sure that people continue to work in solidarity, democratically, and in terms of mutual support, and not in terms of competition. The understanding here is that it's easy to approve the idea of intercooperation, but it's not necessarily easy to put it into consistent practice. So working on intercooperation, connected to that is the idea of shared leadership. Shared leadership is, of course, a participatory democratic principle, and it's been quite difficult to put that into practice because, for example, the local council believes they have absolute leadership given to them through democratic vote. But an absolute leadership of that kind means that you don't necessarily work with the community. Okay, so you have to find a way to combine political leadership with community leadership, and community and political leadership with university or academic leadership, so that the leadership is shared and not led by a single entity with only a limited knowledge or limited expertise in particular areas. social value business approach. This is something we're currently working with right now. I'm currently working on a social value toolkit to encourage different understanding of value when you talk about procurement, when you talk about economics, when you talk about social and community capital. So the idea of developing a social value business approach is to encourage businesses, whether they're cooperative businesses or anchor institutions or small businesses or big businesses, all businesses, to encourage businesses to reconsider the value of what they do in every respect, in employment, in procurement, in all manner of means, so that the focus isn't uniquely on economic and financial value. The value is shared with a social value as well. And sometimes it might be a good thing to have a little bit less financial return for a little bit more social value return, for example. So that kind of thing is important. It's also important because if you're going to work locally, you understand that local quality employment is important. You want the people locally to be given good quality employment, not only because it generates money for them, but because it gives them a job and it gives them the social capital associated to the job. Now, there may be a reason, there may be a financial reason, for example, for employing someone at a cheap rate from outside Preston. There may be that financial reason, but that financial reason is a very poor reason compared to to creating a local quality job, right? So that's an example of how social value might work. Another example is how much value do you put on decreasing the carbon emissions in the contract? So if you have a big global corporation, maybe they bring big trucks from Europe or planes from China into the country in order to provide for your contract. So the carbon emission is very elevated. But if your contract is local, then it's just a short truck ride from A to B and a very much reduced carbon emission. Maybe it's cheaper to bring something in from China financially, but it's more expensive in terms of carbon emission. So which one of those do you choose, and why and how? These are all the kinds of questions that we have when we consider social value in the business approach. And finally, the idea of culture and awareness. By culture, in this case, we mean cooperative culture, developing ideas that people can understand about why it's good to cooperate with your neighbor. It's good to cooperate with the business next door instead of competing with the neighbor and competing with the business. So to some of us, that might seem obvious, but to many people, that's not obvious, particularly after 30, 40 years of neoliberal capitalist development. Many people have a mindset that assumes that the competitive individual edge is the single most obvious and important way of developing society, economy, and business. So to change that mindset, you need to proactively work towards it. Okay, so what about beyond Preston? So it's true that the Preston model has sometimes been criticized for being too much about Preston, for being a little bit parochial. And so we have always tried to to say, actually, it's not so limited to Preston, that these ways of working are perfectly available elsewhere. So, for example, the Cooperative Councils Innovation Network in the United Kingdom has been developed to encourage those councils, and at the moment there are 37 national councils in this network, to encourage those councils to engage with community wealth building and to work to cooperative principles and values, and to develop community wealth building, which is similar to the Preston model, in each of the 37 different councils dotted around the UK. So it's a very interesting development, and it's thriving, it's developing in ways which I think are very fruitful. And so in a sense, you have the development of 37 different kinds of Preston model dotted around the UK. And interestingly as well, in political terms, to be a council member of the Cooperative Councils Innovation Network, you don't have to belong to a particular ideology. It's not related to political party. The majority of them are, of course, progressive councils, it's true, but it's not a condition. And there are other councils that are members of this network. And I think that's very, very interesting and very, very important, because we're talking about a system which should not be related to politics. It is related to politics. You can't avoid the relationship to politics, but it shouldn't be related to politics, just as the basic services in our human systems are not related to politics. A good example of that in the United Kingdom is the National Health Service. The National Health Service is not dependent on the party in power. It doesn't matter if you're right wing, centre, left wing, green, all the parties agree to the social need for the National Health Service. So this is the way I see community wealth building developing, as a natural, common sense, shared development for everybody, which shouldn't really be absolutely connected to politics. And here, from their website, are their, if you like, their ambitions, which they are committed to as cooperative councils. They're committed to social partnership, democratic engagement, co-production, enterprise and social economy, maximizing social value, community leadership and a new role for councillors, new models of meeting priority needs, innovation, learning, and walking the talk, doing what they say, not just saying it in theory, but saying it in practice. So I think this is a very impressive list of ambitions which each of those councils have committed themselves to developing. And all of these are fruit of the ideas generated by the Preston model. So speaking a little bit more academically about this, the idea is to move away from a vision of humanity as single individual entities towards humanity defined by relationships between people and things. So a value is not something located inside something or inside individual people, but it's created through positive collaborations between people and things. For example, according to this citation here from Bollier, this theory sees value arising from relationships. Value does not inhere in objects. It emerges through a process as living entities, whether human beings or the flora and fauna of ecosystems interact with each other. In this sense, value is not fixed and static, but something that emerges naturally as living entities interact. So we're talking about a different mindset, a different view of the way things work in order to create that kind of ecosystem. Other developments. Interestingly enough, we have other developments which seem to go against the idea of the local in the Preston model. For example, the United Kingdom includes autonomous governments in the nation of Wales and an autonomous government in the nation of Scotland. And in both of these countries, this is an example from Wales, you have an attempt to develop the ideas of community wealth building on a national scale. So in Wales, they call it the foundational economy, which is very much a circular economy influenced by community wealth building. So that's an interesting national development. In Scotland, they even have a minister for community wealth and public finance. So that's quite recent. He was appointed Minister for Community Wealth and Public Finance in 2023. So you can see the influence of the Preston model extends even to an attempt to design Preston model type work on a national scale, presumably by having local development interconnected by national policy. So what kind of evidence do we have for the results? First of all, very interestingly, Preston, that used to be a deprived area, Preston was a typical area from the north of England, which was a post-industrial area with very serious problems of deprivation, poverty, and employment. However, as you can see here, in 2018, 2019, 2021, it's gone up in the index, which is here done by PricewaterhouseCoopers, the index of good city growth. So for the Preston, for example, in 2018 was the most improved city in the United Kingdom in terms of growth. In 2019, it's the highest performing northwest city, climbing one place to 12th. In 2021, Preston comes 16 on the index, the highest performing city in the northwest of England. So, I mean, these are very, very striking statistics, especially if you know what Preston was like in 2008, 2007. These are very impressive. And not only are the results impressive in themselves, they're impressive in their consistency year after year after year. And I recently participated in a public health research trying to understand the public health impact of the Preston model. And this is published in the Lancet, the Mental Health Wellbeing Impact of Community Wealth Building Programme in England, that's in Preston. And the result of this study demonstrates that public health in Preston has improved compared to similar cities in the UK that haven't employed community wealth building. So it seems that the Preston model has a direct public health benefit for the people of Preston compared to other similar cities in the UK. Okay, we had a lot of support, political support from the Socialist Labour Party in the UK when there was the leader, Jeremy Corbyn, was the leader of the opposition party. And then he resigned, and now we have a different kind of Labour Party. And many people were worried that this would be the end of political support, and therefore it would be the end of initiatives like the Preston model. When we were working on community wealth building in Preston, I was also, with politicians from Preston, part of the Labour Party's Socialist Community Wealth Building Unit based in London. and the idea was that we were developing new laws, new policies for implementation in the United Kingdom when the party would be voted into government. They were not voted into government, and so this unit was closed. And so we were concerned there'd be the end of this kind of initiative. But actually, it hasn't been the end. And it's very interesting that there is not a dependence on central government or political parties for the development of the Preston Model community wealth building. And it's very interesting. It's a sustainable process within itself, precisely because it's in Preston, for Preston, and it does not depend on external investment. It does not depend on external policy. It doesn't matter about the government. The government, the national government, might be right-wing, might be left-wing, might be centre, might be green. It makes no difference because the policy is developed within Preston. And amazingly, that's actually what is happening, because the model is continuing today despite changes in government. So what do people in Preston say? So first of all, people, the local community, not the politicians, not the academics, the people on the ground, they perceive it as hopeful and optimistic, and a discourse of potential transformation. It's positively identified to strong feelings of organizational and local pride. You are now proud if you live in Preston. It's a good place to live. There's satisfaction for being part of a homemade collaborative and effort, highlighting things that you are concerned about, the social value, and prioritizing the common good, prioritizing your neighbor, communities. For example, a quotation here: since an individual's employment status, living conditions, and income impact their health as much as accessibility and quality of healthcare do, the Preston model, contextualizing economic growth in a more holistic, quality of life way, is really important. And then another quotation here: most people here are proud of the model and want to do a great job for Preston communities. They're not in this in order to drive shareholder value. And then another quotation: it's fantastic sharing good practice for our community. To be part of this effort as someone born in Preston has been great. Positive individual self-perception has been developed. There's a gradual adoption of cooperative culture and democratic governance ethos in anchor institutions. There's an awareness of how the Preston model is positively viewed from outside Preston. People are coming from all over the world to Preston. People from Japan, people from Korea, people from Italy, people from the United States, Canada, Australia. They come to Preston. This is new for Preston, yes? 15 years ago, nobody came to Preston, and now people come from outside to see what's happening in Preston. There are profound feelings about the social and effective value of the Preston model for the local community, and senior executives of the anchor institutions appreciate the more enhanced voice and participation of local people in the overall governance and development of Preston. So what are the learning outcomes from this? First of all, to develop this kind of model, you need support in the beginning from specialist change makers. For example, university or a think tank such as the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, people who have specialist knowledge and are able to offer alternatives. There's a need to join the dots to make everything connected. There's a need for some evidence that change is actually happening. And there's a need for combining strategy and policy with actual cultural change. Second, there needs to be some sort of political and strategic and community buy-in. So people from the community need to be persuaded to contribute to the work. It can't be left just to the politicians or the strategy makers or the university. There has to be community buy-in. Number three, it's more than economics. Procurement in the anchor institutions can drive social change. Cultures can change, even in bureaucratic surroundings. Number four, it's necessary to create networks. Relationships and networks are vital, absolutely vital. Maybe not in the very beginning, but if you want to sustain the model over many years, you need a strong network. Five, a vision based on cooperation and participatory democracy. Okay, and finally, if I've still got time, have I still got time? Yes. If I've still got time, yes, I have still got time. I'm going to make some comments on the effects of the Preston model related to climate change. So in collaboration with my colleagues, Mark Doris, Yuan, Charlie Parry, Anna Ferrier, John Berry and Kate Raworth, we considered the potential to combine climate change action with ideas from the Preston model. And we took advantage of the effects of the pandemic as well, because the pandemic was actually an encouragement for people to do a lot of the work that we were doing before the pandemic. In other words, working collaboratively, cooperating in partnership, not competing, being local, all of those things which are features of the pandemic, they were already features of the Preston model before the pandemic. So maybe the pandemic was pushing people more towards this kind of work. So the first thing we understand, and this is as true of Kate Raworth's donut economy as it is of the Preston model, is replacing the gross domestic product indices with something else. The GDP as an indicator of growth is not appropriate for community wealth building, and it's not appropriate for taking on climate change, doing something about climate change. So it's necessary to develop indicators and objectives, for example, the OECD Better Life Index, including public health statistics, as we already have done by analysing the public health impact of the Preston model, socio-economic equality, levels of well-being, as we can see in the PricewaterhouseCoopers results and the results of our own research, ideas of deprivation such as fuel poverty, free school meals and so on. These are the things that are indices of social value growth connected to the Preston model and connected to improving the situation in the fight against climate change. So because we were speaking to Kate Raworth, we thought a fair bit about the donut economy. And of course, as you probably know, the donut model consists of two limits. The outer limit is the ecological limit, the planet, and the inner limit is the social limit. If you don't satisfy the social, then you can't guarantee the ecological. And if you break the ecological, you break the social. So they are interconnected with each other. And there's a question of balancing the two. And in a sense, you might say that the ecological limits are obvious because they're scientifically based. Things like the ocean, the air pollution, the fresh water, these things can be measured by science. But the social foundation, the social limits are very difficult to measure by science. Some things are measurable, for example, housing. Does everybody have a house? Is that house a good house? But other things, for example, gender equality, are very difficult to measure. They're more a sense of quality and value than they are measurable. So we thought, and we are thinking of introducing the ideas and the models behind community wealth building and the values that support the Preston model as being the central core of the donut economics. Now, as you may know, a good example of this is in Amsterdam, where they have their own model of community wealth building, and they're explicitly adopting the donut model for their economic system. As it says here, Amsterdam wants to be thriving, it wants to be equitable, it wants to ensure a good life, and at the same time, it doesn't want to compromise the natural boundaries of the earth. That's what the Rawworth's model is all about. So Amsterdam shows an example of a big city, major city, adopting this kind of approach, this kind of model. So how does the climate action join in with social action? Here's some ideas emerging from our initial research. Climate action requires joined up interplay between national and local action. Local action without national support is problematic. National policy without local buy-in will fail. Everything in these models is about balance. So you want to balance the local with the national with the local. Even if central government is not involved, that doesn't mean you can't be national. For example, the Cooperative Council's Innovation Network is national because it consists of 37 councils dotted around the country, but it's not dependent on central government. So it's national, but it's not central government national. It's still national. So national doesn't necessarily mean governed by central government. Particularly at local level, effective climate action depends on local government adopting and enabling a partnership-based approach. Everything in the Preston model is about partnership and relationships. And without partnerships and without relationships, the model would fail. Mobilizes the energy and investment of non-state, private and civic actors, as well as wider public sector. I think it needs to be inclusive, not exclusive. It's not just about local deprived communities, it's about businesses as well. It's about anchor institutions, it's about everybody who's involved, because of course, the socio-economic system and the difficulties of climate change affect everybody. And that's a really important part of working towards the common good. Relationship building, the co-creation of shared vision and new capacities for delivery are vital components of local climate action and should be institutionalized in bodies such as, for example, climate commissions. So local councils, local politicians need to work with citizens to democratically participate in shared leadership. For example, by creating climate commissions where people from the local community can join together and be an advisory body for the council. And there are different examples of how this can be done. One way or another, it's necessary to share leadership, to develop participatory democracy, and to make sure that communities have an active, a proactive buy-in to decision-making. Climate action must encompass both the drive to reduce emissions, mitigation, and measures to prepare for the physical risks of climate change adaptation. So, you need to mitigate, you need to reduce the effects, but you also need to adapt to the effects of climate change. You need to do both of those things while we struggle with the problem. So, in our research, it was suggested that COVID-19 encouraged anchor institutions to think long-term and embed this perspective into strategic planning For some, the pandemic combined with the imperative of looking ahead to the challenge of climate change and prompted a review of organizational strategy to ensure this was fit for purpose in the future. And in anchor institutions, they highlighted the unique opportunity presented by COVID-19 to build a different and better future. And you can see in simple elements of this already. So since the pandemic, a lot of people work more at home and virtually online. In terms of reducing carbon emissions, people travel less. In the UK, it's very normal for people to have a 1-hour car journey into their place of work. If they do that 2 times a week instead of 5 times a week, and if they do that on a large scale, then they are reducing their carbon emissions. And they're also becoming better people in their communities because they're more present in their communities as well. So they develop community relationships in a local sense, and also they reduce their carbon emissions. So the development of community wealth building is, or can be, very much linked to climate action. So we made several recommendations. Obviously, I'm not going to read all of these, but we made recommendations for city level recommendations to use COVID-19 as a springboard to accelerate transformative change, to consolidate cooperative approach developed during the pandemic, to continue to prioritize action on inequalities, to build on the positives in the pandemic, to prioritize development across the city. At an organizational level, to review organizational responses, capturing learning. Education and learning is fundamental. This is a new socioeconomic system, and the problem of climate change is a new problem. So we have to continue learning, we have to continue teaching, we have to continue being self-aware, and of course the role of the university in this should be paramount. Need to promote well-being through nature-based and other social prescribing. We need to take a radical approach to future work policies in practice. We need to implement whole system and whole life cycle costing approaches to plans and ensuring sustainable operations. One of the aspects of the Preston model and one of the difficulties and also the potential positives of dealing with climate change is that we're dealing with something which is holistic. What we can't do is fragment our climate action. We have to deal with everything all at once. And it's the same with community wealth building. It's not a question of focusing on one small aspect of community wealth building. It's all interconnected and needs to be approached in a holistic fashion. Review opportunities for education and training. Build on the vision set out in community wealth building and advocate collectively to support national policy. If it doesn't come, it needs to be continued anyway, but you still advocate, you still campaign for central government change. Recommendations at community level, obviously very linked to community wealth building, to advocate for citizens to have a voice in future planning, decision-making and action relating to the climate and ecological emergencies through the establishment of a citizen-based climate assembly. It's vital that communities are authentically active in participating in decision-making. Absolutely vital. We will never achieve success either in community wealth building or climate action if we rely on one or two leaders. Second recommendation, celebrate and nurture the collaborative culture mobilized at grassroots level by voluntary community and faith sector organizations, strengthening their capacity to address inequalities, tackle disadvantages, and strengthen resilience. So people work very hard in voluntary organizations, in community organizations, in religious and faith-based organizations, they need to be rewarded and supported, not just left to do what they can. And then finally, build on the practical projects already underway and explore opportunities for wider partnerships and extending impact. Okay, thank you for that. That's the end of the talk. I've got no idea how long I spent talking, whether I've gone too much or too little. And these are a couple of books that I've recently published.
Boa tarde, nós vamos iniciar os debates, então, e para a sessão de hoje, da discussão desse importante projeto, né, social, chamado Modelo Preston, eu convido a professora Gabriela Celani, da Faculdade de Engenharia Civil e Arquitetura e Urbanismo da Unicamp, que é líder, né, de um centro de pesquisa que está justamente estudando de que maneira que a Unicamp vai participar da criação de um polo de desenvolvimento que está em discussão na cidade de Campinas. Eu agradeço muito a Gabriela Celani pela presença e ao professor Julian também pela excelente exposição, inspiradora.
Obrigada, Nelly, obrigada pela apresentação, obrigada pelo convite. Okay. No, you can sit. You've been standing for so long. I was sitting all the time, don't worry. So, first of all, I hope that this is catching my English. Do you think it works well? Yes? Okay, good. So, first of all, I would like to thank you so much for your lecture and also congratulate you on the fact that even not being an economist, you've done so much for the local economy of Preston, and you have contributed so much. And then I was thinking, and I was even asking Nelly, I said, does he have an education in economy? And then I was thinking, you know what, I mean, I don't know a lot about psychology. I know you're a psychologist. I don't know a lot about it, but I understand that one of the most important things in the well-being, the psychological well-being of a person is being accepted in their community, right? I think that this is part of your psychological development, being accepted, feeling part of a community. And in that sense, it makes a lot of sense what you did in terms of the local economy, because that actually at the end, it resulted in people really feeling as part of their communities, being able to speak up and give suggestions and participate, and also helping creating wealth and helping keeping that wealth for their local environment. Another thing that I really like is that you gave a lot of examples that are physical, because you were telling us all the time, because we talk a lot about networks that are based online. People talk to each other in different parts of the world, in different countries, and so on. They create these networks. But we were always stressing the importance of being locally present, right? And doing stuff like meeting, in-person meetings, and also local businesses, local production, local materials that are being transformed locally. So that's a lot of physical stuff. And I, as an architect and urban designer, I'm very interested in this type of thing, because that is related to the city and to the design of cities. And so I'm interested in how we, as urban designers, we can design a better environment, a better physical environment that can also contribute to what you've been searching, like this interaction, local interaction between people. So I'm very interested in, or not just me, but our group, our team of urban designers, we're interested in what kind of physical environment can foster this interaction, can foster this collaboration. But really, like, not just internet connection, not just having a phone that you can talk to somebody in another part of the city or the world, but how these spaces help in this interaction. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a bit about our project at our university right now. So actually, not just right now, but ever since 2013, when our university acquired a parcel of land that stretches into this area that is called the Campinas High Technology Pole, which had been created in the 1980s. And but it was, I mean, it does have certain technological institutions, such as for example, the particle accelerator, or CPQD, which is the former communications company, the Brazilian communication company, which was privatized, but they had their development R&D center there. But other from that and a few firms that established their research centers there, this area of the city remained underdeveloped. And then when the university, because they had a certain economic opportunity, with a certain economic opportunity, they had this possibility of acquiring this parcel of land, which is contiguous to our present campus. So the university opened up possibility of interfering in the development of that area, which had remained a bit underdeveloped. And then there was a lot of criticism, because even I myself, I said, okay, we have a lot of spare land in this campus, and why are we acquiring this other land here? So what are we going to do there? And there was also a lot of criticism for many people, but at the same time, other people saw that as an opportunity to help developing something that, you know, it was the role, because maybe we're kind of an anchor institution, like you said, because, you know, we are so big as a university in Campinas, that we have kind of this role of helping in the development of the local economy. But now I'm talking about mainly knowledge economy, the knowledge economy, because we don't produce goods, we produce knowledge, we produce innovation. The University of Campinas is the major university in Brazil in terms of patents, producing patents or depositing patents from research. So we kind of have this role of helping in this development. Of course, there is a lot of sides to it, because we know there is a lot of political interest. There is this boom in the construction right now in Brazil. You have probably seen a lot of construction, as many other countries have been through recently. There's this financialization of homes, right? The UN says that, you know, housing is a basic need, a human right. It shouldn't be financialized. It's not like gold, right? But still, we do have this phenomenon right now undergoing in Campinas. So there is a lot of other interests, and people try to focus on those other interests. But I think that we do have an opportunity here. And I had the chance to be part of a working group that has the responsibility of proposing a way of occupying this new land. And what we've been thinking about is, and actually what we're in fact proposing to the University Council, is a new model of occupation, because which is much closer to maybe the Preston model, which is more based on community, but also on preoccupation, on a worry about, you know, environmental impacts. So in this campus that you've been visiting, the original area was parceled in blocks, and each block was given to one of the faculties. And they could either just keep a single building in the middle or maybe build another one or so on as they needed. But there was a lot of land leftover land in each of those blocks. And in this new area, we plan to build only as we need and not just, make like a patchwork with, different plots given to each of the faculties, but start building where there is already some existing infrastructure, where it makes more sense to build, and just in the amount of square meters that we actually need, and in a such way that they do not belong to anybody. They belong to everybody, and as long as they need it and they need the space. We have also been discussing with the community the amplification of certain environmentally protected areas that they need to be protected by law because they're, for example, along the water streams or springs and so on, and also the ecological corridors. But we've been widening them, making them larger so that we can better protect wildlife and so forth. So we've been working with the community expectations, trying to reach a balance between those who are more worried on environmental issues and those who are more worried about, putting their foot on a piece of land and assuring that they will have a space if they need to grow or to make more investments. But I think that for us, the Preston model is a very good example. I mean, it's very audacious in terms of, reaching out, not just talking to our community side. But I was very inspired by your words because it made me think, maybe we should also talk to other people outside in the metropolitan community. And so, and do something like you said, talking more or thinking more about this circular economy that we can establish in our region. Because you're right, like the firms that have already established, are already established in this territory, mostly of them, they came from outside. They're not based in Campinas. So my question to you is, how do you think that we should start to reach out, looking at more than just our own university community, and how can we start creating this network of local business? We're not talking about any kind of business. We are talking about the knowledge economy, of course, because this is what this area which was established as a technological park was meant for. So how do we start this movement outside of the university? This is my big question for you.
What a question. Obviously it's a very difficult question for me to answer because it depends on local knowledge, which I suppose you have at least more than I have. But if you believe that you don't have sufficient local knowledge, I think it's important to establish relationships with leaders, community leaders of different kinds, and begin the establishment of trust, and to go, I think moving slowly is important. We're always making the mistake of trying to go too quickly, and forgetting that the establishment of trusting relationships is absolutely vital, and it's more difficult to go back than it is to move slowly forward. So, for example, I don't know. You see, I don't know the situation in Brazil or Unicamp, so I'm not saying anything. I'm just speaking from my own ideas and experience, which could be wrong. But I think when we first got the procurement officers and the finance officers of the anchor institutions together, we brought them together in a room in the council. So there's a finance officer for the university, the finance officer for the hospital, the finance officer for the housing association, etc. When we got them into a room, it was the first time they'd ever met. And they were quite reluctant to meet because they're busy. They have many things to do. And so it was an effort to get them into the same room. And even though it was an effort, and of course you have to remember that they're busy, and secondly, they may not have as much respect for academics as we would like. Sometimes they think, and many people think, that academics live in a world of theory, and academics think they are cleverer than others, and that they're detached from the reality of their work. No? And so it's quite difficult even to get them together in a room. And once you do, then the problem is a problem of facilitation, and maybe it's necessary to have an expert in facilitation to help develop the contacts between these people, because you don't want them to come to the room once and then never again. You want them to come to the room on a regular basis. Now, there comes a moment, a magic moment, when if they have been coming on a regular basis together, they start to know each other, they start to trust each other and to trust you, and then, only then, are they prepared to think differently, to think unusual thoughts. So the unusual thoughts for the Preston model, for your project, are not thoughts you want to introduce in their absolute entirety from the beginning. In a sense, they're almost thoughts that you want to develop in such a way that it appears that they're emerging from the people themselves, not from a predestined idea as developed by your colleagues and yourself, for example. So the first test is only to keep them meeting for enough time to build trust. So the aim is trust building and relationship building. And then once that's developed, then is the moment to start introducing
Thank you. So I think your answer really makes a lot of sense. Because I was thinking as you were talking that one of the characteristics of the Preston model, as you explained, was that there was no money available, right? Here we have the same situation. There's no money available. So we have to raise money for this project for developing the area. But even though we have already had some meetings with people from some anchor institutions, it's always a meeting of like the top rank people, like the rectors or maybe the secretary or something, but not as you suggested, people who work really with the, the economic, people who deal with economic issues, like I don't remember how you described it. How you described that people, the economic people, the
economists.
Economists, yes, exactly. So the economists of each institution, maybe that's a good idea because we never thought about doing that. But maybe these people can come up with something more plausible in terms of how to raise the resources needed to start something, how to think about some sustainable way of starting the project itself. So I think that's a very good idea. But anyway, I wish I can, we can collaborate and maybe we can meet sometimes and I can tell you how it is going and maybe ask you for some suggestions.
That would be good. And I think that it's also possible to have different methods, different kinds of approaches. You don't have to choose one only. You can have your smaller meetings of leaders or experts, and at the same time you can have the wider meeting of stakeholders in general. So for example, I don't know if you've heard of the method open space technology.
No.
And this is a way of bringing everybody into a room and understanding that sometimes the best idea and the best information comes from the person who's least asked sometimes. And so you have an opportunity for smaller groups of experts, but also very big groups of everybody. Sometimes I've recently been thinking about community development in public health, which is an aspect that I'm researching. And when we talk about experts with the funder or the potential funder, we talk about community leaders and people in community as experts by experience, as opposed to experts by education. And so experts by experience often have the ideas and thoughts that the experts by education don't have. But it's also true that the experts by education sometimes have ideas. So you need multiple strategies, I think, to make it a success.
Yeah, I think that's also another great idea, and we definitely need some techniques for extracting ideas from the community. But anyway, the good news is that exactly this morning we had a presentation of our ideas for the area for both the internal community at the university and external community or for people who live in the area around the university. And at this time, instead of a lot of complaints that we've had in the past, this time I felt that people were more happy. They were happier with what we were presenting because I believe they felt heard.
Yes.
And because we have been implementing what they have been suggesting, but the thing is that there are different groups at the university playing for different aspects that are not necessarily compatible one with the other. But I think that at least this morning I felt better approval from the community. So I think that we are starting to build that sense of community.
Well, I think that's great. And I think from an academic perspective, as I've been saying to colleagues last week, it's important to adopt an abductive reasoning as opposed to reductive reasoning, because abductive reasoning will ensure inclusivity. And when you say they want to be heard and they're happy when they're heard, it's important to understand that the they must include as much everybody as possible. From a sort of intellectual perspective, that means opening out possibilities which maybe intellectually one would prefer to reduce because of the complexity of abduction and the complexity of including strange or unusual or uneducated or uncultured positions. But I think it's vital to bring in the different positions and points of view and to make sure that everybody is heard. And the danger is to pretend that you're listening to them instead of really listening. That's the danger. That's quite a skill. That's why in the beginning maybe working in partnership with an expert facilitator might be interesting until you establish the relationships of trust. Once you establish relationships of trust, everything's easier. But between the first moment and the establishment of trust, it's very careful facilitation is required to get to the place of trust.
Yes, and another thing that we're planning to do now is establishing some smaller working groups on different aspects of the project, such as infrastructure or mobility and so forth, so that we can include people, but in smaller, more like specific groups.
And also at some time, join them together. So separate, but join, separate, but join. Because otherwise, of course, you're fragmenting the potential interconnectivity between the different groups. So you also have to have a policy to join them together at certain times as well, I think.
That's a great tip. Well, so I think that I thank you so much again for, all this presentation and all the contributions, and I hope we can continue talking, and I will keep you posted about how the project evolves.
I'll be very interested. I'm interested to know how you get on, and who knows, maybe I can participate somehow, even just by email or maybe online, however, whatever suits the situation.
That would be great. Thank you. Você quer fechar? Or do we have questions from a gente tem perguntas do público?
O público não tem perguntas, eu vou fazer duas perguntas rápidas.
Tá bom, então vem cá.
Olá, meu nome é Nery, eu sou historiadora. Hello, I'm Nery, and I'm a historian. Preston has 330,000 inhabitants. Does the size of the city have any bearing on the results obtained? I would like to ask questions about social dynamics. How was it possible to mobilize the community in Preston to understand and accept the proposal? This issue interests me because people can radically demobilize in crisis situations. In the dynamics of transformation, it was possible to identify a specific moment from which there was an acceleration of the transformation process. It's okay?
One single question.
No, two or three, but it's the same concernment about society facing crisis and thinking to the climate crisis.
Yeah, well, first of all, the question of the size of the city, a very interesting question. And I can't be sure of the answer to the question. My feeling is that yes, it makes a difference. So the city of Preston is maybe a fortuitous size. It's not so small that it doesn't have any anchor institutions and it doesn't have many community groups. But on the other hand, it's not so big that it's impossible to identify where the anchor institutions are. It's impossible to contact all the community groups. So, for example, we're in contact with colleagues and partners in London. Community wealth building in London is quite a different thing to community wealth building in Preston. So if you go to London, where do you identify the anchor institution that serves your community? Because London has maybe 8 million people, and it's very difficult to identify community. It's very difficult to identify where the anchor institution sits, and so on. So maybe London is too big for the exact version of the Preston model, and a smaller place will be too small. However, remember, we're not saying that the Preston model is a template for every place. We're saying that the principles of the Preston model are cooperative values and principles, and these can be applied to different situations in different places, and that the community wealth building system that you would like to develop in London, or that you'd like to develop in a place smaller than Preston, would need to respond to the specific local needs of the specific place. For example, maybe a smaller town or small village has connections with the farming community, with the agricultural community, which Preston doesn't really have, and London definitely doesn't have. So maybe a small town version of community wealth building would be concentrating on the relationship between the farming communities just outside the town and the town itself. So each place needs to develop community wealth building according to its own specific needs and realities, as long as they are interested in democratic governance, in democratic principles, in cooperative principles and values, equality, equity, participation, self-responsibility, autonomy, and so on, all of those things. And it doesn't matter how big or how small you are, if you're a politician or a leader, then you have to learn to communicate and to give decision-making powers to the people in the community, whether it's a small community in a small town or a medium town or a big city. It's the same principle. The principle is that people need to participate in democratic governance. That's the absolute principle. And from that principle, you develop relationships between people, and from relationships, you develop partnerships. And all of these things are vital to community wealth building. So was there another question? I think there was, wasn't there? I can't remember.
It's okay.
How do we persuade people to commit? It's a process. We're talking about a process. So we're not saying we persuaded people to commit. We're not saying that. We're saying that through the constant process of community wealth building, which is a constant process, a building process, through the constant process of encouraging relationships and cooperative working, more and more people come to agree to be committed to a greater or lesser extent. Some people become very committed, some people become a little bit committed, and some people are not committed at all. This is not utopia, this is reality. But you work with the reality to constantly develop the relationships, and people begin to buy in to these things. But some people don't, and some people have good reasons not to. Some people are too poor, some people are too busy, some people have other difficulties to consider. This is realistic, this is not utopia. We understand that you need a certain amount of commitment from a certain number of people, and that needs to be renewed constantly renewed as a constant process. So, so I think that's important. Having said that, it's also true that commitment and interest comes through results. So the fact that you can prove that you have actually increased local wealth by, in the UK, millions of pounds, if that's a fact, then people want to be interested, they want to be involved, they think that's good, they're proud of being involved in that kind of process. So on the one hand, you're constantly working to continually develop the process of relationship building, and on the other hand, you actually achieve results and you demonstrate results, which brings commitment, okay? The results, of course, is chicken and egg. Which comes first, the result or the commitment. So that's why you have to constantly build on the process anyway, whatever the results. But the results also help. It's got to be realistic. It can't be just an idea. So people buy in to something real, something that's actually happening, not just a nice idea.
Vocês têm uma pergunta? Thanks, Julian. Eu agradeço ao professor Julian Manley por essa belíssima conferência que nos coloca diante da concretude da mudança e da sua importância. Então, eu espero que tenha sido uma oportunidade valiosa para vocês também. Desejo a todos uma boa tarde e que esse modelo Preston e as suas conquistas e os seus aprendizados e, sobretudo, os seus valores que estão no fundamento do modelo nos inspirem para a transformação, para a mudança que existe. Muito obrigada. Boa tarde. Thanks, Julian. Yes, I'm
glad you liked it.
Yes, for me, as a historian, to see the changing